Live from our hurricane headquarters with real-time analysis from some of the nation's top meteorologists, this is Tracking the Tropics, powered by Bose Electric.
This edition of Tracking the Tropics, I'm meteorologist Rebecca Berry here at our WFLA streaming studios. What you're looking at right there in the center of the stream has been talked about for over a week now, and it finally formed as of that 11 a.m. advisory. Tropical storm Melissa has formed. Joining us right now, meteorologist Juliana Mejia, and she has been working hard all morning long getting our graphics prepared for you and exactly what you need to know, because there's been so much speculation about this storm. And so we know you do have questions and comments. This is an interactive program. If you'd like to ask us a question about Melissa or anything going on in the tropics, or if you would like to weigh in on what you think Melissa is going to do, and with your tropical expertise, you do have to use one of our branded hashtags for us to be able to pull your comment into our system and display it on the screen. So once again, questions start either with hashtag Hey Rebecca or hashtag Hey Juliana. But for right now, I'm going to send Juliana to the wall to explain what is going on. So that 11 a.m. advisory is where we saw Melissa form.
Yes, yeah. So here's a look at a fairly healthy tropical storm Melissa. So initially, like Rebecca said, we've been talking about this system, what was Invest 98L, for so long. Literally since it emerged off of the coast of Africa. We've been watching this for days and days and days. And really, once it started nearing the Caribbean, what prohibited it from developing up until this point was how fast it was moving. So now we've really slowed down the pace, previously moving 25, almost 30 miles per hour at times when it entered the Caribbean, now having backed off as of the 11 a.m. advisory to about 14 miles per hour from what I had last seen. And so here's a look. Yes, moving to the west at 14 miles per hour, 50 mile per hour winds. What you see here are some of those active tropical storm and hurricane watches for portions of areas like Haiti as well as Jamaica. But 50 mile per hour winds and that forecast cone. There is, to be very clear, a high degree of uncertainty with the long-term forecast of Melissa, and you'll see why I say that here in just a moment. But overall, the short-term forecast between today and then into, or rather tomorrow into then Thursday, generally very slowly going to be hanging out here in the Central Caribbean, maintaining tropical storm status. At least that's the forecast for right now from the National Hurricane Center. Eventually taking more of a northerly, maybe northeasterly jog into Friday morning, picking up the pace here steadily, though, upwards of 70 mile per hour winds Thursday into Friday. And then eventually this is where you see that pretty much circular blob where the forecast then reflects what the forecast models have been showing of kind of this stall out heading into this weekend, meandering here a little bit. Quite literally then, one, strengthening into potentially at least a Category 1 hurricane, but then hovering here between Hispaniola and Jamaica this upcoming weekend, and then still likely hanging out in northern portions of the Caribbean into the top of the upcoming work week. So here's a look at the spaghetti model plots that give a good idea at least of the positive trend now that's been reflected the last 24 hours, I want to say, whereas yesterday and this past weekend there was still a lot more variety and a greater spread with the forecast models in terms of that long-term forecast, but now all of them are starting to jump on board with taking an eventual turn to the north and east, drifting this out into the Atlantic at some point. The difference here now is simply when, how early or late. A lot of these wanting to turn this over areas like Hispaniola or more so eastern Cuba. A little bit on the earlier side, of course. This is still looking out to next week, so it's going to spend a lot of time here in the Caribbean, whereas then other models, for example, we'll take a look at the European being one of them, are really drifting this a little farther to the west, keeping this here hanging out in the Caribbean for much, much longer, and then eventually turning over more central portions of Cuba and entering out into the Atlantic. So a lot of things to keep in mind here, which is the good news for the mainland United States, being that this trend has kept, and really pretty much the vast majority, if not almost all of these forecast models and ensemble members keep the system out of the Gulf. So that is the good news, because that is typically what we're looking for, is these Caribbean-based or even Gulf-based systems that then can be a problem for the Gulf Coast of the United States. But as of now, we've got wind shear working in our favor, these frontal systems that are going to be working in our favor, and as well as just this forecast stalling it out and eventually the upper levels dragging this out to the north and east. We'll take a look at all of that here in just a second. But wind shear, while it looks to act like a nice blocking mechanism, also will do a good job of likely maintaining a weaker system, or at least kind of shredding up this system if and when it does turn over the fairly mountainous terrain of portions of the Greater Antilles here this upcoming weekend, and then into the top of the next work week. Still going to be encountering, one way or another, quite a bit of wind shear in that long-term forecast. But of course, going to be hanging out over quite a bit of warm sea surface temperatures, a lot of energy here for the system to tap into. It already has been infiltrated throughout its life so far with some drier air, some of that wind shears. That is also why it took some time to get Melissa. This is actually a different sea surface temperature graphic I wanted to show, but you get the idea here. I'm going to hop back over to jump around in some of these graphics. Yeah, it's an interesting forecast, to say the least, given how much uncertainty there is with that, weekend next week's forecast.
Yes, and so the uncertainty will become a little bit less moving forward once we get a couple of model runs, once we fly through the system a little bit more. And also how fast it develops has a lot to do with where it eventually ends up, because if it does form pretty quickly, it'll most likely turn a little bit faster. But it's just going to be tempted to hang out over the warmest sea surface temperatures on the planet right now, just to the south of Cuba there. Unfortunately, that's going to be, if it does take longer down there and stay south of Cuba longer, it will be eventually be a stronger storm and then take that later turn, which would potentially have a much higher impact on the Bahamas and possibly a little bit of the Keys, as far as rough surf goes.
Yeah.
And so we're just watching that steering flow at this point. I was watching our TikTok comments come in, and someone recognized you from your time in Fort Myers.
Oh,
well,
fun.
we stole her from Wink. She's here now in Tampa.
Having a blast.
Yes. But thank you so much. And remember, if you do want to have your comment featured or question featured, use hashtag Hey Rebecca or hashtag Hey Juliana, and we'll be able to answer those comments and questions for you. It just looks like it's going to be sitting to the south of Hispaniola for so long. I'm really worried about the flooding impact there.
That is one of the, I think, biggest elements of the forecast that they're going to be looking out for, flash flooding, because of its heavy rainfall. And like you said, sometimes, which is what we have seen in the past too, with either really slow moving systems or systems that kind of just park somewhere and they just have the opportunity to dump a ton of rain. The steering flow forecast is really curious to me, and I'm kind of curious to see what shakes out. I'm curious who wins, because there's this initial, luckily, shout out to Chief Meteorologist Jeff Berardelli for having put this together. Luckily, one way or another, the jet stream is acting as a nice protecting mechanism for Florida, either scenario that plays out here. So there's the initial dip in the jet stream that a lot of models are kind of clinging on to, of potentially then sweeping the system on the earlier side, taking it to the north and east. Whereas then what we're seeing reflected in things like the European model of the second dip in the jet stream being what eventually lifts it. So like you said, this will depend on how we progress in these next few days, how Melissa strengthens and organizes better or not, and whether or not, if it's large enough and strong enough to get picked up by one of these dips in the jet stream, which one it will be. And so that's that secondary dip in the jet stream. And this is then the layout, which is why, throughout this morning, even since yesterday, we've all been communicating that at least the trends are positive for the mainland United States, and keeping this out of the Gulf. There's also to show y'all what that upper level pattern kind of looks like, where that initial, actually I'm going to go back here, that initial dip in the jet stream, this I will say is the European model, and of course with the upper level forecast you can look at many models to get an idea, and they'll show variety. So in this case you can see how shallow the dip in the jet stream is, but showing a little bit of maybe trying to tug Melissa to the north and east. But then in this case, with what you're seeing here, the European model hinting at more of that stronger secondary jet stream being the which also then is attached to another front. So all of this just to ease everybody's mind, I'm loading it in here, that we've got cold fronts in our favor, we've got the upper level steering in our favor. Of course, there's a lot of chatter about as well, like could be a close pass of whatever this system looks like to portions of one, the Bahamas, but South Florida at that too. But of course, keep in mind, wind shear, all of that, really going to eat up and eat away at whatever the system is at that point in time.
I am curious especially once it gets over the warmest waters, it's moving closer to those warmest waters right now, but I am curious as to how much the shear impacts its ability to really strengthen, because when it has that much fuel, you have to believe that there's at least a small chance that it does pop it up to a higher category there before the wind shear starts to really eat it apart.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It'll be the battle of both elements there in the forecast. And then also here to show y'all the split. There's still a really big,
that's big
split. And it's been consistent like that between the GFS and the Euro. And I know typically the Euro is the better performing, historically speaking.
Mm-hmm.
It has from season to season, been bested. So again, it's kind of interesting, and I'm curious to see what happens.
That is usually at this point in the game, the GFS and the Euro are not that vastly different. So it is interesting that they're so vastly different. And that's just another indication of how uncertain the forecast is. And my rule of thumb is I like to get 2 model runs after a system actually forms, because the model runs before a system forms are usually complete garbage on the spaghetti models, because they're all choosing their own center of rotation.
Yeah.
It hasn't formed yet. There's no center, but I like for all the data from 2 model runs to get put into all of the models, and then so I'm looking forward to the evening track, because I think that'll give us a little bit more clarity, although the track doesn't go far enough out to really make a consensus call as to which it's leaning towards, more the European or the GFS, although this particular track does look like it's more of a GFS friendly track. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. I know, I agree. And I know the National Hurricane Center was explicitly also mentioning taking into account the Google DeepMind here. It sounds like it's kind of one of their primary models that they're leaning into in this case. So also curious there, because from what I had last seen, it sounds like the Google DeepMind is kind of roped in with more of leaning towards the American in this case.
Well, what's interesting about this track is where it does hedge its bets is it's taking on the timing of the European, having it hang out down there longer, but the path of the GFS. So that's kind of interesting too.
Yes, a little bit. Again, they're trying to run in the middle of the road here.
Yeah. But they're going to have to pick a side, man.
Yeah. Yes.
This is an interactive program, so if you use a hashtag #HeyRebecca or #HeyJuliana, we'll be able to pull your comments and questions onto the screen. And the first one coming from Selena, #HeyRebecca, #HeyJuliana. What is the track? Well, the track is here, but it's a little messy. It doesn't give you all the answers you might need to know. I know people have cruises scheduled this time of the year. People have days off and time off, and they want to know what's it going to be. And right now, it's still a little too soon to tell if the Bahamas are going to be heavily impacted and how long they might be impacted. But what we do know at this point is Hispaniola is in for significant flooding if it stalls out just to the south of Hispaniola and Cuba there for that long.
It'll be. It's one of those. This is a tougher call, I guess, for, like you said, people that have cruises and stuff. But I agree, Jamaica and then the western kind of half there of Hispaniola, not going to be great. At the very least, very, very squally weather, if not dealing with some hurricane force winds coming up into this upcoming weekend.
Yes, and so the next featured comment comes from Caitlin Garner, #HeyRebecca. So it's unlikely to really hit Florida. Absolutely unlikely. And Juliana was explaining why. We're basically protected by shear and a front at this point. The steering flow at this point dips so far down south as we work into our fall weather pattern. It's really hard for a storm to hit us in this time of the year. It's pretty unlikely. And if they do hit us, it's typically tropical storm strength because they fire up on the front, right on the tail end of the front. That's our typical formation that we see this time of the year, is that right on the front there, we may get a spin up tropical storm. But this, scenario like this playing out is just really highly unlikely that it would come close to Florida. The European is a little closer to Florida, but it's closer to like the Keys and Miami, but still not a direct impact. It's just rough surf and wind there. And so we're looking at the European model right now. The Juliana is queued up for us. And so the European has it hang out south of Cuba for so long, but that's the closest that it gets to Florida right there on Tuesday into Wednesday. And so the outermost rain bands and some of the tropical moisture gets pulled across the state there. But you can see the front plowing across the state as well that pushes it right back out over the Bahamas and then in the general direction of Bermuda. Bermuda's not had their favorite hurricane season this year, but it's Florida's favorite hurricane season so far.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Yeah.
I'm liking this season so far.
Exactly. Our next featured comment comes from James, hashtag Hey Rebecca, why are the models always so varied? And it's interesting because when I started my career 20 years ago, they were all over the place. It looked like cooked spaghetti. But this, even though they vary quite a bit, it still has the general consensus that it's going to move sort of to the northwest for a few days. Now the models are varied on how long they will move to the northwest and how fast they will move to the northwest, and then taking that sharp curve to the northeast. And so even though it's about a country apart, from the easternmost model to the westernmost model, science has come a really long way for us to even have this sort of consensus. And maybe you're also seeing there's one model called the Clipper. And if we took it off of here because it's so confusing and it's not useful. And so the Clipper model just continues the storm forward at the same forward motion. And so right now, the Clipper model, if it were on here, it would just show a line going into the Gulf. Well, that's not good for prediction. That's never going to happen. It's climatology versus the forward motion of the storm is the only components of that forecast model. It doesn't take into account any fronts, any highs, any low pressure system, the steering flow. And so that is one element that we tried to remove because it just causes confusion and uncertainty, and it's not helpful from a forecasting perspective at all. There's no real threshold for being a spaghetti model. If you made your own model, you could have your line too. There's no checks and balances. There's no one managing that. There's no Karen asking for the manager to get the Clipper taken off. And so when you do look at spaghetti forecast models, just know that a lot of it has to do with who's putting that forecast graphic together. Do they have the knowledge that the Clipper model is not useful? Do they have the knowledge that some of the models are made for ships forecasting, for the seas? That's what they're focusing on more so than the direction. So whenever you see social media stuff, just know that a lot of it has to do with clicks and likes and engagement, unlike here on Tracking the Tropics, where it's all science with Juliana and I. All right, Jelani Norman saying, hashtag Hey Rebecca, any weather jokes? I don't have any good weather jokes out there right now. So we got to move on from that one. And so then our next hashtag featured comment is from Young GMC. Is Cuba going to get it? Pretty much. Cuba is in the forecast cone right now. It's a question of whether it's more of an eastern Cuba impact, a central Cuba impact. And then the European has the most western Cuba impact there, but Cuba is certainly going to be impacted by this system. Now, one of my other rules of thumb is all bets are off until it goes over Hispaniola because of the mountain range there. And some of the parts of Cuba are like that as well, with the terrain that tends to rip these systems apart. Yeah. And so once they get over those mountains, they often reform that center of rotation further east or further west than originally predicted. So that's another kind of interesting factor, but I think that the steering flow at that point will be so strong, pushing it away from Florida. I don't think that's going to be an issue.
It'll be pretty quickly like whoop, just out of here.
Yes. And then Terry, also a featured comment, hashtag Hey Rebecca, what are the AI models showing? They are showing more of a GFS and more of an eastern track. Most of the AI models are showing a more eastern turn faster, but I do think they're a little slower than the GFS. The GFS acts like Melissa has somewhere to be because the GFS pulls it out fast.
Yes, the GFS is like impressively quick with this. Here is actually what it looks like. What happened? What happened here? So this is looking tomorrow, Thursday, and then Friday. The GFS is like, yeah, she's already over the Bahamas. She's heading out into the Atlantic. Yeah, and then play this out. So this weekend in the Atlantic, next week, literally gone. Like out in the North Atlantic. So that would be great. Of course, either way, right now, I know somebody was asking about Cuba. Mm-hmm. Cuba, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Haiti, the Bahamas are all going to want to keep an eye on the system one way or another for this next, unfortunately, week plus. Depending on how things shake out, of course, the faster in this case, just kind of get it done and over with. But like we talked about, and also I think at that rate too, it all depends. The timing will depend. But if this stalls out, it'll have a better opportunity to be stronger, which is not ideal for anybody involved.
Yeah, and so the ideal scenario for Cuba, Hispaniola would be the GFS because it gets in and out so fast. Because anytime you have a long duration of a storm sitting there, it's a cumulative effect as far as the rougher seas go, the rainfall and flooding goes. And so the longer it hangs out, the worse it's going to be for Cuba and Hispaniola and Jamaica. But unfortunately, it's just not one of those that we have the answers to right now as to how long it's going to hang out there. If it continues to strengthen over the next day or so pretty quickly and get more organized, that does lend itself to that more faster turn to the north. But if it starts to really just kind of sit down there and take its time, then we're going to see the further impacts for those areas and potentially a bigger impact on the Bahamas, because the GFS, it's not a great day in the Bahamas on Monday if the GFS is true, but it's nothing like what you would see if it were a stronger storm that sat over those warmer waters for longer and then moved directly over the Bahamas.
Yeah.
All right. Hashtag Hey Juliana, is there anything behind this that we should be worried about? Because we are Floridians, we are a little triggered by the hurricane season to say the least, and that's everyone's big question is when can we breathe a sigh of relief?
Yeah, and it's funny because I knew this question was coming. I knew somebody was going to say something like, "Oh, are there other tropical waves out there?" So I whipped this up. I was like, "No, we're gonna look at this." So yes, technically there are other tropical waves, but as you can see, nothing really exciting. I want to say because I build this based off of the National Hurricane Center's marine surface maps and such, and even these tropical waves, which are quite literally waves of energy, waves of lower pressure, and there's not a whole lot of convection really associated with many of these. So no, at this point in time, and even given the National Hurricane Center's official forecast, Melissa's the only thing on the map for us right now.
Yes, and we love to see that. And, that's probably the biggest asked question in September and August here. All of our colleagues stop by and ask us, what do you think about this season? When do you think we're done? And it's really hard to get a storm close to us from this time of the year onward because of the steering patterns, because of cold fronts coming down. And so this was something our chief meteorologist, Jeff Bardelli, built yesterday. Notice how many of those lines are green. So this is hurricanes that formed between October 24th and November 30th since 1900. So that's not many, and take out the green lines because the green lines are tropical storms. And so a lot of those green lines were what we just talked about, how this time of the year, sometimes when a front pushes into the Gulf, a little tropical storm can spin up on the tail end of the front. It's just enough, energy for it and enough disruption for a little tropical storm. And so the bulk of these, let's count them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Basically 7 of those were tropical storms. That only leaves 3 that were hurricanes that made landfall this time of the year since 1970. And so 4 Gulf Coast and 2 Florida landfalls that were Cat 1 plus. And so most of those were tropical storms. I'm not ever one to say just a tropical storm because oftentimes we have a lot more damage with those because people don't take them quite as seriously and we get a lot of inland flooding. But man, it's just a better time of the year to be in hurricane season right now than the past couple of months. So that is something that we're pretty happy about here on Tracking the Tropics. All right. This is the last call for questions. This is one of our featured comments. We're going to have to wrap it up in about 5 minutes. This is from William. Hashtag Hey Rebecca. Florida has been lucky this hurricane season. Yes, we have. We have been so lucky. We've been historically lucky. It hasn't really been since 2015 that we've been this lucky. And 2010 before that we were this lucky. We have a lot of tropical storms this season. Most of them were fish storms. We love a good fish storm.
And actually here I also pulled up the comparison of the season so far.
Yeah.
And it's, we're kind of just like almost at pace, I want to say, falling behind. Like you said, it's been mostly tropical storms for hurricanes. Usually at this point of the season, we've had 6 hurricanes, but we have had 3 rather than on average to date. Typically, we only see 2 of them being major. So bit of a mixed bag. I feel like it's all kind of balancing itself out in terms of, because again, the accumulated energy, taking into account the energy of these systems in total across the season, that more of these have been tropical storms. We're down below average at this point compared to typically what we see in terms of the energy produced out of the season. So no complaints from your local meteorologist.
None whatsoever.
About how everything has played out so far.
No. This is one of our featured comments coming in from Dave. My youngest son is working on a cruise ship heading down to the Caribbean. Just how safe are they? Now, the good news about cruise ships is they might be bigger weather nerds than we are, and that's hard to do. So they're paying hyper attention to this forecast, and they're very good at driving around to the backside of an island and riding some rough seas out. They don't drive into the storms. They want to keep all of their guests happy and not ill, and so they will change their itineraries and drive around these systems. They'll tuck back behind Cuba and that sort of a thing, so that they are protected from the seas and the wind. All right, and here's a fun question that we don't know nothing about. What about winter storms?
We don't know nothing about it. You're asking the wrong people. The closest to that is going to be us tracking cold fronts.
Yeah.
And unless maybe they're asking about like the possibility of winter like tropical systems.
And it's not impossible, but it's certainly not likely.
Yeah, that's the reason why statistically the season cuts off at November 30th. But I remember, was it 2023, 24 that we had like a retroactive January storm?
Yes,
or something
they went back and determined that a storm that formed in January was in fact a tropical system. I don't think they took a name for it, but they just kind of noted like a little asterisk on that year.
Yeah.
Like we've had a storm form in every single month. We've had a December storm before, and we've had that January storm. And so it's not impossible, but it's not likely, and it's even less likely to approach Florida just because of the steering currents at that time. So that's the good news. Any last thoughts, Juliana, before we wrap it up?
I don't think so. Gonna keep our fingers crossed. The light is sort of at the end of the tunnel. We're what, like 40 days?
Yeah, we're squinting at it. We're like, it's over there.
It's almost here. End of the season.
Yes. So thank you so much for joining us on Tracking the Tropics. Juliana does all the heavy lifting for this. She builds all those graphics and she puts together the forecast. Thank you so much, Juliana, from the Streaming Center live here at WFLA in Tampa. And we're going to wrap it up for today. But if nothing else happens, we will see you next Tuesday at 12:30. If something happens, though, we're going to pop right back on and let you know exactly what you need to know and what we do and don't know and what you can expect out of the tropics. Thanks so much for joining us.